When Rudolf Hess arrived at Nuremberg to be tried alongside 22 of his former Nazi colleagues, all key leaders around Hitler, the former Deputy Führer presented a pitiable figure. Rudolf Hess had been a vigorous, well-built man possessed of boundless energy, but the figure who was admitted to the military prison adjacent to the court was completely different. The most notable difference being his weight. He was now extremely thin, recorded as weighing just 143 pounds or 65 kilos on arrival, which is quite low for a man 5 foot 9 inches tall, and was still obsessed with the Allies poisoning his food. However, though clearly suffering from some kind of mental illness, real or imaginary, and despite previous attempts to end his own life whilst in British custody, Hess was judged to be of sound mind by prison psychiatrists and fit to stand trial for his life. The only difference from the other defendants was that Rudolf Hess, when outside of his cell, was handcuffed to a guard to prevent any sudden attempts to harm himself. The question of whether Hess really was mentally unwell was soon settled. Initially, Hess claimed he couldn't remember many important things about his life earlier as Deputy Führer. The Nuremberg chief psychiatrist, Dr. Douglas Kelly, after repeatedly examining Hess, reported that he really was mentally ill. Kelly said that Hess was basically a paranoid individual with a schizoid personality and hysterical, and that his amnesia may have been real or partly feigned. Despite this lack of clarity, Kelly pronounced Hess fit to stand trial. Efforts were made to shake Hess out of his amnesia by bringing his former secretaries to visit him in prison and by showing him old newsreels of himself at the height of his power. The chief medical officer, Lieutenant Colonel René Juchli, stated that Hess was intentionally refusing to remember or to confront his past self and his actions. On the 30th of November 1945, Hess made the extraordinary admission to the court that he had actually been feigning his memory loss as a defense tactic.
Ich habe gleich zu Beginn der Verhandlung meinem Verteidiger einen Zettel.
He said that he had been feigning, pretending his amnesia, and he wished the tribunal now to know that he was in possession of his faculties, that his concentration was a little disturbed, but that he could remember now, and he wished to take his place with his fellow defendants and to be tried.
In November 1945, the trial opened, and Hess was asked to enter a plea, guilty or not guilty. He replied to the world by shouting the German word Nein or no.
Rudolf Hess.
Nein.
Which was recorded by the court as a plea of not guilty. During his trial, Hess admitted to signing many Nazi decrees and laws, but defended his actions by explaining that such matters were merely part of the internal workings of the state, and therefore outside the realm of war crimes.
A number 3 man who was merely an innocent middleman, transmitting Hitler's orders without even reading them, like a postman or delivery boy.
It was a version of the inadmissible defense, "I was only following orders." Importantly, the defense stated that since Hess had left Germany in May 1941, he could not be held responsible for the actions of the German government after that date, which was completely true. On the 30th of September 1946, the judges passed their judgment. Hess was found guilty on 2 counts: crimes against peace, meaning the planning and preparation of a war of aggression, and conspiring with other German leaders to commit crimes. Hess was found not guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Along with 6 other Nazis who had been given prison sentences rather than being sentenced to death, Hess was transferred to the Allied military prison at Spandau, Berlin on the 18th of July 1947. He would never leave this place alive. Here is where things become rather weird to our modern eyes. Hess and the other Nazis had been tried by the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg. They were now to serve their sentences in Spandau prison, under the authority of the Allied Control Council, a joint organization formed of Britain, France, the United States, and the Soviet Union, that at the time governed, defeated, and occupied Germany. Each nation, therefore, took turns at guarding Spandau. They would rotate each month. Even as the Cold War began to intensify and the Soviet Union went from an ally to an ideological and military foe of the three other members of the Allied Control Commission, the rotating guarding arrangement remained in place. It continued even when the Berlin Wall was built in 1961. Every 4 months, a detachment of 40 Soviet troops were to come to the British zone of West Berlin to guard Spandau prison. And it became increasingly ludicrous as the other 6 Nazi prisoners completed their sentences and Hess remained the only prisoner inside a vast prison, still guarded by the rotating nations that defeated Nazi Germany in 1945. Hess was assigned a number on arrival at Spandau. He became, and would thereafter be referred to until his death, as Allied prisoner No. 7. The military guard's job was to secure the prison, manning various security positions around the perimeter and patrolling the grounds. The prisoners had little or no interaction with the soldiers. That was left to a group of civilian prison warders drawn from the various Allied powers. The regime at Spandau was fairly harsh during the first decades. Each prisoner had his own cell, and they were moved every so often to fresh cells. They were not allowed to speak to each other without permission. They also had to work, performing various menial chores about the grounds to keep them occupied, mostly cleaning or gardening. They were also permitted a single 60-minute outside walk each day, where warders would hang back from them at least 10 yards to give them some privacy. Mail was limited. Prisoners were allowed only 4 pieces of paper each month to write to family and so on. There was a small library they could use, and they were fed a simple prison diet and given regular medical checkups and any treatment as necessary. However, as time wore on, some of these rules were relaxed. Prisoners could receive visits for 30 minutes each month. Hess, strangely, refused to allow his wife and son to visit him until 1969. By that stage, he had not seen them since 1941, 28 years before. This fact alone has fueled conspiracies that the man in Spandau was not the real Rudolf Hess, and the long time delay before seeing his family was to ensure that any changes between the real Hess and his double would be erased by old age and unfamiliarity. It should be pointed out that the author Hugh Thomas, once a British Army surgeon at Spandau prison in the 1970s, and who personally examined Hess, was very surprised to find no evidence of shrapnel and gunshot wounds that Hess had received in World War I on the prisoner's body, despite Hess being completely naked before Thomas on 2 occasions. Thomas would subscribe to the notion that the man in Spandau wasn't Rudolf Hess, but a double. This is outside the scope of this video. In 2019, it was reported that scientists from Salzburg University in Austria had DNA tested a sample of Hess's blood that had been taken from the prisoner decades earlier in Spandau, with DNA of a Hess male relative, finding a match. If this test is indeed true and above board, and not some kind of intelligence disinformation operation, then the man held in Spandau for 41 years was indeed Rudolf Hess. As time went on, the Spandau inmates completed their sentences and were released. In the 1950s, Konstantin von Neurath, Nazi foreign minister from 1933 to 38, Walter Funk, Hitler's economics minister and president of the Reichsbank, and Grand Admiral Erich Raeder, the leader of the Navy, were all released due to ill health. In 1956, Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the last president of Nazi Germany, completed his sentence and was released. Then, in 1966, as I mentioned in Episode 1, Baldur von Schirach, Hitler Youth leader and Gauleiter of Vienna, was released along with Albert Speer, Hitler's armaments minister. Now only Allied prisoner No. 7 remained, 1 prisoner in a prison with 600 cells. Hess had been sentenced to life imprisonment, unlike the others, and it appeared that he would remain at Spandau for the rest of his life. Concerns had consistently been raised about Hess's mental health. In 1957, Hess had been examined by the prison psychiatrist following a long period of crying out at night, complaining of stomach pains, and complaints that his food was still being poisoned. He was judged to be of sound mind. In December 1969, Hess suddenly permitted his 69-year-old wife and 32-year-old son, Wolf Rüdiger, to see him. At this time, Hess was in the British military hospital in Berlin with a perforated ulcer. In 1977, Hess made another attempt to end his own life. Attempts were made to have Hess released on humanitarian or medical grounds. The problem seemed to be the Soviet Union. Their right to guard Hess for a month in every 4 months allowed them to send their troops into West Berlin, a valuable intelligence-gathering opportunity, and also a propaganda coup. They were loath to voluntarily give up their rights to enter West Berlin and base their troops in the West, and they officially vetoed any attempts to free Hess, though not for these reasons, of course. The reasons given were always that Hess had not shown any contrition for his crimes. Hess could only go free if all 4 of the victorious Allied powers agreed. So Wolf Rüdiger Hess was very active attempting to get his father released, starting in 1967. By 1974, a petition to release Hess had collected 350,000 signatures, but the authorities were unmoved. Then, in September 1979, it was found that Hess had prostate cancer. British Foreign Secretary Lord Carrington made an official appeal to have Hess released, but despite Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher's support, the Soviets again refused. Their excuse was that Hess had shown no remorse for his crimes. In truth, Hess remained what he had always been, a Nazi and a vocal anti-Semite. Interestingly, one of the possible reasons often cited in the Hess conspiracy that prevented his release was fears that Hess would speak to the press if he was allowed out and reveal embarrassing things, particularly embarrassing things known about British politicians and perhaps members of the royal family and Nazi peace overtures and various secret deals, much of which still remain confidential to this day. However, this theory tends to have been disproved by the Thatcher government actually publicly calling for his release in 1979, unless of course they only made the offer in the full knowledge that the USSR would veto it, which they did. Hess himself made several attempts to get information out of the prison, basically a statement that he had not been allowed to read out in full in open court in Nuremberg in 1946. He had first tried to post the copy to British fascist leader Sir Oswald Mosley in 1946, but US guards at Nuremberg had intercepted it. Then in 1986 he tried again, befriending Spandau prison chaplain Charles Gable, asking him to smuggle the document out of the prison to journalists. Gable was caught by a Red Army guard and lost his job. The statement basically made the following points: that Germany had attacked the USSR in June 1941 because of evidence that Stalin was about to attack Germany, and that secondly, Hess had decided to fly to Scotland without Hitler's knowledge to make peace between Britain and Germany because of the great danger of Soviet communism, both to Europe and the wider world, that the British would understand it was in their interest to join with Germany and fight against the USSR. And so we come to 1987, and the last day of Hess's life on the 17th of August. In the next episode, I will forensically examine the circumstances of Hess's death, presenting new evidence that contradicts the official British investigation. Strong evidence exists to suggest that Hess was indeed murdered. Join me for Episode 3, and prepare to find out the truth of the demise of prisoner No. 7. Many thanks for watching. Please subscribe and share. Also visit my audiobook channel, War Stories with Mark Felton. You can also help to support both of my channels at PayPal and Patreon. Details in the description box below.